Canada was doing okay. It was pretty free. How come we're this, bizarre authoritarian nation? I have to explain to them, well, there was this slow creep amongst our decision makers over the last 20 years away from just interpreting and applying the evidence and interpreting and applying the laws to imposing their own views on society and remaking society in their own image.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Gray, and this is Gray Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Those of you who follow the show will know that recently we published online a video essay of a paper that I wrote called Here I Stand. It's for a book that I'm writing called Leftist Lies, Laws, and Liberties, soon to come out. But that paper discussed an issue that we're going to delve into today, and that is what is happening with professional colleges and societies, these self-governing entities that control professions in Canada. And more importantly, what happens when they decide to mete out discipline and individuals go before these boards of discipline? Should we be concerned about whether or not these boards have been corrupted or are following, let's say, a pro-government narrative and not giving fair, impartial hearings? Well, today on the program, we have our good friend James Kitchen, Liberty lawyer, fighter with the Liberty Coalition Canada. And we also have one of his clients, Dr. Wall, who's an Alberta chiropractor who's been impacted in this way. We talked a little bit about Dr. Wall the last time James was here, but today we're going to get into this in more detail. So welcome to the program, James, and also Dr. Wall.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you for having me.
All right. Before we dive into the topic more directly, as we always do, we're going to go to our aphorism sports. These ones, it won't surprise, deal with masks. The first one is from Oscar Wilde, who once famously wrote that a mask tells us more than a face. Next one is from French author Victor Hugo, who wrote that virtue has a veil and vice a mask. The next one is from a friend of the show who's been on a couple of times and is someone very well known, has about 500,000 followers on Twitter, and that's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. And he just tweeted this today. He said this about a Cochrane study that we're going to be talking about, a meta-analysis on masking. He says, the bottom line, the New York Times unethically involved itself in a scientific dispute to spread the false idea that high-quality scientific data say masks work to stop respiratory virus spread. So why are we talking about masking today? Well, the main reason is that Dr. Wall took a very courageous stand that resulted in him being disciplined and indeed suspended by his college. So, James, I wonder if we could start with you and explain basically what the whole legal dispute is, and also talk about how the decision unfolded recently. I understand there was a hearing some time ago, and then finally the decision came out in February.
So the primary dispute, and again, thanks for raising this issue, because I know part of the problem is that issues come and go, and people tend to forget about them. But this issue matters legally and culturally to us, and it's going to continue to matter, partly because it may happen again. And the reason the way that we potentially prevent that is by dealing with it properly now. So the issue for Dr. Wall always was in the beginning, this thing gives me trouble when I wear it. And it gave a lot of people trouble. People who are listening will know that. They will remember from wearing it how much trouble it gave them, whether it was headaches or lightheadedness or dizziness or nausea or whatever it was. And so Dr. Wall had some pretty serious symptoms as soon as he tried to wear this thing. And it not only impacted him, it impacted his ability to serve his clients, which he really cares about. He's a long-time chiropractor. He's got a lot of long-time patients. And so then it becomes an issue of physical and mental disability. These are protected grounds in the Human Rights Act. And this used to be a big deal that we really try to help people who have disabilities equally participate in society.
Right.
Unfortunately, nowadays it's become more about whether or not you're black or you're gay or you're something else that's really popular these days. If you're disabled or you're religious, those grounds don't really matter as much anymore, and that's really unfortunate. But that's always what it was about. It was about accommodation and the Human Rights Act, which, of course, is quasi-constitutional legislation and supersedes any sort of public health order. That's the law on paper. That hasn't been the law in practice, unfortunately. That's the law on paper. And that's what the case was always ultimately all about. We tried to explain that to the college. I was involved early on. The college would have none of it. They tried to suspend Dr. Wall's license on sort of an emergency basis, which is the kind of thing that's reserved for when professionals really go off the rails, like they're raping their clients, they're stealing money, that type of stuff. That's what that's reserved for. So they were sort of, implicitly comparing Dr. Wall to somebody who's actually hurting his patients, and obviously Dr. Wall wasn't. They were unsuccessful. Dr. Wall kept his license, and he actually practiced without a mask for 2 years while these proceedings went on, and of course nobody was harmed. So we had our hearing, and the primary argument was about, look, there was no undue hardship on the college or on anybody else because masks don't work. And if they don't work, that means there's no undue hardship. It means you have to accommodate Dr. Wall. You have to permit him to not wear a mask because he has mental and physical disabilities. He has reasons for why he can't wear one. It makes him, it causes symptoms for him, as it does for many people. No surprise there, right? And of course, we brought in the scientific experts to back that up, right? To show that they don't work. And if they don't work, this is how the legal analysis works. If they don't work, there's no undue hardship. He has to be accommodated. And if he has to be accommodated, that means you can't discipline him for having a disability that renders him unable to wear a mask. That was the main argument. There were some other issues in there because in addition to the college attempting to punish him for not wearing a mask, they also wanted to punish him for not telling his patients that masks work.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so there was some compelled speech aspects. So I did bring in 2B of the charter. I did talk about freedom of expression, and I said, look, professionals obviously have the right to express themselves if what they're saying is true, right? The college cannot censor its health professionals if what they're saying is true. They may not like it, but if it's true, well, free expression protects true speech. You cannot penalize true speech as being unprofessional to share if it's true. Right. Again, going back to that whole idea that scientifically speaking, as we know from the Cochrane study and all the other stuff before, masks don't work and they actually are harmful. We brought in Chris Schaefer as an expert as well to talk about how they're harmful. So Dr. Wall discussed these things with his patients. The college took objection to that, tried to penalize him for that. And so that was compelled speech. So that was sort of a side argument to the main issue. So that was, it was a huge case, but that's sort of the essence of it.
Thanks for that, James, for that explanation. That sets us up rather well. Dr. Wall, I want to come back to you. And if you wouldn't mind, maybe take us back to the early part of the pandemic when you first discovered, it first came out. Now it's been, we just passed the 3-year anniversary of the announcement of a worldwide pandemic. So take us back to that time in your practice. And how did you decide to deal with that situation within your practice as a chiropractor? I know you've been practicing in Alberta for over 20 years at that point. But how did you decide to deal with that in terms of, were you going to continue your practice? How are you going to deal with your patients? Could you take us into that moment and those decisions that you made?
For sure. Yeah, when the pandemic first rolled out in early 2020, quite honestly, I was quite skeptical about the narrative that was being portrayed by the provincial and the federal health associations. And right away, I didn't buy into the fear aspect. I thought there's something fishy going on here, where the whole world seems to be following a certain narrative and just totally disregarding basic common sense and really science from my end of things. I just, so right off the start, I was pretty skeptical, and I dug into looking into the science and following certain people who were well respected in the health industries across the world, and looking at their thoughts and their perceptions about what was going on. And so that kind of led me down a path of right away, not perhaps trusting what was going on with the whole narrative. But and then our college came out with the pandemic directive. And of course, like all health professions, there were certain regulations that were put in place, and one of them obviously was masking. And honestly, I wore a mask initially to obey those rules. But right off the start, putting a mask on, I was very aware that not only mentally was I anxious, felt claustrophobic, but physically I had symptoms as well. And so that was a struggle in my mind because I couldn't concentrate well when it came to note taking
Mhm.
and discussing with my patients what was going on and treating them. I felt physical disabilities, mental disabilities. So after a couple of months,
How long did you wear the mask, Dr. Wall, before
yeah,
you
no more
decided
than a
to?
couple of months,
Okay,
no more than a couple of months.
yeah.
Yeah.
So a pretty good sample size anyway.
Yeah, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And so at the end of that couple of months, I decided that no, I couldn't do this and offer the best care to my patients. So I stopped
Mhm.
wearing one. I did not indicate that or tell the college that. And then fast forward to December 2020, where an anonymous patient of mine complained to Alberta Health Services that I wasn't wearing a mask. And
Oh boy.
so Alberta Health Services contacted me. We had a brief conversation, and the health officer said that they were going to pass that information on to the college. The next day, I received a call from the registrar. We had a brief discussion, and I told him that I was not able to wear a mask and that I was mask exempt. He said that they had to deal with the public perception of health, and so yeah, then the registrar passed the call on to the complaints director. The complaints director called me the next day, and a similar conversation ensued. And again, he was more concerned about
Mhm.
the public health versus my accommodation of not being able to wear a mask.
Uh, and Dr. Wall, you had actually not only were you very disclosive with the professional college, but you had actually gone to your patients and sought their consent to treat them without the mask on, right? I mean, you were very, very clear with them, and you gave them the option, the choice of having you wear the mask or not wear the mask. Is that right?
Yeah, I had several interactions with patients that asked me questions about it, and I was very upfront. There was no negativity
Mm,
from a patient point of view. They were very accepting. If there was a patient who was not comfortable with my not wearing a mask, I would not have known it. They may have disappeared, but I wouldn't have known at the time. So,
mhm,
but yeah, most people were very understanding.
mhm. So, but at some point, despite all of this, the college decided to suspend you and not permit you to practice. Is that right?
Well, there was actually no suspension, but the complaints director did say that he was going to start a process of suspending my license, and
Okay.
he had to pass that decision on to a council appointed person to kind of solidify that.
Hmm.
And that person actually said that no, we're not going to suspend Dr. Wall's license, but we're going to put practice conditions on him, and he can continue to practice. And
And
so
did
those
those
practice
conditions include masking?
no, those practice
Oh, good.
conditions were basically obtaining patient signatures who the patients were aware that I was not wearing a mask, that I had a mask exemption,
Hmm.
and that they were okay to be treated by me and without my wearing a mask. And then the second condition was that they would sign a form that said that they were basically the pre-screening questions um, for COVID conditions were all met by that
Hmm.
patient. And so that was the two conditions that all patients had to sign before being treated.
So, how did this turn into a disciplinary situation?
Go ahead, James.
So after the college failed to get that what was supposed to be an interim suspension, that's when they launched the proceedings to actually go to the
Right.
hearing.
Okay.
Right? But it took a full year and a half to even get to the hearing, right? And then of course it
Wow.
took another 7 or 8 months to get a decision. So that's how, even though this started in December 2020, it wasn't until
Hmm.
January 2023 that we got a decision, right? Because it took all that time. I mean, initially the college had to actually adjourn because it couldn't find an expert. I put 3 experts in. They couldn't find one. They told me they had to adjourn at the last minute to find an expert. Then they found one.
Right.
And I found
Can
a fourth one. So
can I ask you a question about this, James? Because I want to make sure I understand this correctly, because this was really appalling. My understanding is their expert was basically a GP. It was not an expert at all. He was just somebody who had medical training. But
and if
you produced
yeah.
like eminent, world-renowned experts that, someone like Dr. Fauci or Dr. Tam would call a fringe person. But I mean, we're talking about Dr. Byron Bridle, people of that nature, right? Very, very eminent experts on COVID and the efficacy of masking. But in the end, my understanding is the college actually preferred the evidence of the college's so-called expert to this whole army of very renowned experts that you produce. Is that do I have that right?
Yes, and
Oh,
it's really quite laughable. It's really sad. It's almost as if the 4 people on the tribunal who made this decision, they sort of expect nobody's going to read this, nobody's going to read the transcripts, nobody's going to hold us accountable, nobody's going to care. Like, it's really quite laughable. It's an 87-page decision. It's quite long, but the analysis is really poor, like embarrassingly poor. I mean, obviously, I read a lot of terrible decisions from judges that just totally disregard people's individual rights and freedoms and say government is great and government's the answer to everything.
right. Yeah.
But this has got to be one of the poorest, most embarrassing decisions I've ever read. And one of the interesting things about the decision is it never cites to the record, right? There's a 1,400-page record in this case. The decision never cites to the record, right? I submitted a 50-page factum that has about 100 citations to the actual transcript record of the evidence, right? They didn't cite to the record once. They just sort of blithely say, well, we prefer this this expert here that the college has, even though he made 2 retractions, even though he had only a quarter of the academic citations, even though, he was actually very juvenile and unprofessional, even though most of the time he was just insulting the other experts instead of actually engaging with them in a debate.
Really?
Even despite all those things, we're going to prefer his evidence. We're going to ignore Dr. Byron Bridle, the eminent vaccinologist and immunologist. We're going to ignore the respirologist. We're going to ignore the medical microbiologist that's getting his degree in epidemiology from the London School of Economics. We're going to ignore all those people, and we're going to take this, this hip young doctor from Calgary who's into the COVID vaccines and was advising Dr. Hinshaw on making these CMOH orders. We're going to take his advice, even though he's just a GP. He doesn't know anything about immunology or anything like that. It really is. It's quite pathetic, really. That's the word I'd have to use to describe it.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting topic, and I want to come back to Dr. Wall and get his impression of this. But we recently had on this program a couple of lawyers, James will know about this, who created a petition in protest of mandatory, essentially racial sensitivity training for lawyers that had nothing to do with their competency. And also there's a very, very highly publicized case right now involving Dr. Jordan Peterson, who is being made to take social media sensitivity training. Seems to me he should be teaching that course given his success on social media. But it begs the question of what is going on with these professional colleges. So, Dr. Wall, you've been a chiropractor for a long time. What is your impression of what's going on with the college? Are you concerned that there has been a political shift to the left within your profession and specifically within your professional college?
Yes, excellent question, and absolutely, I've seen this shift. I've had discussions with family members over this, saying, 10 to 15 years ago, I could see a subtle trend where the regulatory aspect of the college had more and more power, was coming out with more and more standards of practice and code of ethics that seemed to be more heavy-handed. And so, yes, I'm very aware of this happening, and it is disconcerting. It makes a member, I believe, of these regulatory bodies just kind of more fearful of practicing. You're wondering if you're going to get crushed by your regulatory body at any moment for
Right.
some strange little thing. And so, yeah, it is a very big concern of mine.
I wonder, gentlemen, whether either of you think that there might be hope on the horizon. It seems to me that a professional college has chased a very big, angry, powerful bear into the woods in the form of Dr. Jordan Peterson. And of course, his situation, because he's so well known, because let's face it, he has so much money and he's so smart and so stubborn that he's taken on the psychological college in Ontario. They haven't backed off, but either way, it seems to me that this could have a very broad-reaching effect for all of us who are governed by these self-governing professional boards and colleges. Would you agree with that, James?
Yes, I actually think that's part of the reason why the tribunal couldn't bring itself to follow the evidence in the law in this case, right? Because it would have been a real blow to the pro-mask narrative, and I think that's unfortunate. That's part of the reason. I'm only speculating, but I do honestly think that that's part of the reason why they ruled the way they did. Because if they hadn't have, they knew I would have publicized it, and it would have been a huge blow to the pro-COVID narrative. So yes, I do think there is some hope. I do think there can be some accountability. I do think the colleges can lose, and if people start to care and pay attention, I mean, people cared and paid attention to Dr. Peterson. They showed up, they protested, they're writing about it in the media. I think this is great. When I saw this happen to him, I said, you know what? I'm really glad it's happening to him. It's unfortunate it's happening at all, but I'm glad it's happening to him because he's got the guts and the money and the platform to really bring this to the fore and push back. I'll give you another interesting example. I criticized the Court of Alberta for its vaccine mandate way back in the fall of 2021. There was a complaint filed against me by a lawyer in Ontario who worked for one of the big banks.
I heard about this.
And now I can't give specific details because for some reason there's sort of a secrecy clause, and I'm still trying to figure this out. There's a secrecy clause in the Law Society legislation about how I can't talk about this with any detail. But there was this complaint, basically said, look, Mr. Kitchen's uncivil and he's criticizing the court too much, and that's unprofessional. And ultimately, that complaint was dismissed by the Law Society. Now, I can't tell you what happened and why, right. But I was a little surprised.
You just told us.
I expected the Law Society to take Mr. Kitchen to task for publicly criticizing the court's vaccine mandate. Wow. And they haven't. They didn't. And I'm left saying, wonder what that says about whether the Law Society finally sees a limitation on its own ability to persecute its members. And maybe it says, we won't go after this one.
Let's hope. And,
that's great.
And that's brilliant, James. And let's hope that's true, because it proves that sometimes you've got to fight these fights just to find out where the limits are, right? Just to find out where the boundaries are, in the game that you're playing. We're at the part of the program now where we get into something called the reading list. James had some great suggestions last time. I'm going to ask both of you to perhaps recommend a book or two. The first book that I'm going to refer people to is called United States of Fear. It's specific to the U.S., but has implications also for Canada. This book is called United States of Fear: How America Fell Victim to a Mass Delusional Psychosis. And those who are interested might want to go back and listen to the interview we had with Dr. Robert Malone, who talked about the Matthias Desmond book, the psychology of totalitarianism. But this book is described. It's by a psychiatrist named Mark McDonald, and he diagnoses that we are suffering from a mass delusional psychosis driven by a pandemic of fear in response to COVID-19, which we've talked about today on this program. And he says that as the pandemic unfolded, Dr. McDonald, much like Dr. Wall, grew increasingly concerned by the negative mental health effects he witnessed among his patients and really worldwide. These negative effects include stress, anxiety, depression, addiction, domestic violence, suicidal ideation, all directly traceable to the climate of fear being stoked by public health authorities. Perhaps, Dr. Wall, do you want to go first and mention a book or two that you think would be useful to people taking in this podcast?
I've read so much in the last 3 years. It's unbelievable. A lot of short essays, research papers, etc. But just a couple that came to mind. Recently, I read a book called Solving the Brain Puzzle by Dr. Bill Code. And it gives some helpful insights into how we can protect and deal with maybe toxicities that affect the brain. A lot of helpful tips nutritionally and lifestyle wise. And then another book that was referred to me by James' wife many years ago called Live Not by Lies
Oh,
by
yes.
Rod Dreher.
Roger, yes, brilliant book. Yeah.
Excellent book. A lot of very cogent points made that just have similarities to today that most of us can really, take to heart and live out.
So, James, did you have some new suggestions for us? Last time you had some terrific ones.
Well, I was thinking about this last night, and the book that kept coming to mind was an obscure, unusual one called The Screwtape Letters
Oh, yes.
by C.S. Lewis. Yeah, I'm glad you guys are nodding your heads, but I'm sure a lot of younger people haven't even heard of this book.
No.
And the reason I would recommend it is because it gives a unique window into trying to further understand human nature.
Mhm.
Right. And I don't care whether you're Christian or not. I mean, if you know anything about C.S. Lewis, the author, or the stuff he wrote about, obviously most of his stuff had Christian themes. But I would encourage anybody who is just exploring or agnostic or whatever, read this for its window into human nature.
So, gentlemen, again, I want to thank you, both of you, so much for being with us today on Gray Matter. This has been really an illuminating conversation with both of you. I want to wish you much continued success, James, in all the work that you're doing. And Dr. Wall, God bless you and the fight that you're fighting. I pray that you will win. I believe that you will win. I believe that those of us on the right side of the case will all win. I believe that battle has already been won, and you know which one I'm talking about. The truth has already been won. It was won on the cross. And it's just for us, to quote Dr. Bonhoeffer again, it's for us to walk that out. That's the cost of our discipleship. And both of you are great examples of that. And so thank you very much for all that you're doing, and also for being our special guests here today on Gray Matter.
Thank you so much, Leighton.